In October 1944, just after sunrise in the Philippine Sea east of Samar, a thin American carrier group was already launching aircraft into low cloud and broken rain when radar contacts began to appear where no enemy force was supposed to be, and within minutes the officers on the bridges of 6 escort carriers realized that the protective air cover they depended on was about to be tested against something far larger than anything they had been sent to face. Because this was Task Unit 77.4.3, known by its radio call sign as Taffy 3, a group built around slow escort carriers, lightly armed destroyers, and destroyer escorts, positioned to provide close air support for the Leyte landings, not to fight a surface action against a major enemy fleet. And yet, at 06:45 on the morning of October 25, 1944, the horizon to the west was filling with towering pagoda masts and the unmistakable silhouettes of Japanese heavy units emerging from the squalls, including battleships and heavy cruisers, moving at high speed and closing the range, while the American air cover overhead consisted of scattered patrol aircraft, many already low on fuel, many armed for ground attack rather than anti-ship strikes, and all operating from decks never intended to support sustained fleet defense. And in that moment, the battle where American air cover almost failed began. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 had arrived on station during the night as part of Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet, covering the eastern approaches to Leyte Gulf, while Admiral William Halsey's 3rd Fleet ranged far to the north. And the assumption at every level of command was that any major Japanese surface force would be intercepted before it could threaten the vulnerable amphibious shipping or the lightly protected carrier groups. But during the night, Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, including battleships Yamato, Nagato, and Haruna, heavy cruisers Chokai, Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, and Tone, and a screen of destroyers had transited the San Bernardino Strait unopposed, emerging into the Philippine Sea with the intention of striking the invasion fleet at Leyte. And as dawn broke, the first American radar operators aboard USS Fanshawe Bay and USS White Plains detected contacts at ranges that made no sense for patrol craft or stray aircraft, contacts that grew steadily closer and stronger, forcing commanders to reconcile the unthinkable. That a major enemy surface force had slipped through and was now bearing down on an escort carrier group whose only real defense was its aircraft. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from USS Fanshawe Bay, immediately ordered his carriers to turn east and increase speed, while sending urgent contact reports up the chain. But even as those signals went out, Japanese gunfire began to splash around the American formation, long-range salvos from heavy units still over the horizon but already finding the range, and the reality became clear that air cover would not be a supporting element in this fight, but the primary means of survival. The escort carriers, including Fanshawe Bay, Gambier Bay, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitkun Bay, and St. Lo, carried a mix of FM-2 Wildcat fighters and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, aircraft designed for convoy protection and close air support, not for massed anti-ship strikes against armored capital ships. And many of the planes already airborne were carrying depth charges or general-purpose bombs unsuitable for penetrating warship armor. Yet Sprague ordered every available aircraft into the air, regardless of armament, because any delay would allow the Japanese to close to point-blank range, where the thin-skinned carriers would be helpless. Pilots already in the air were vectored toward the approaching enemy, while deck crews raced to spot additional aircraft, launch them through rain squalls, and improvise armament loads as best they could, all while the Japanese formation continued to close, firing methodical salvos that bracketed the American ships and forced evasive maneuvers that disrupted flight operations and formation integrity. The American destroyers USS Johnston, Hull, Heerman, and the destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, Dennis, and John C. Butler were ordered to lay smoke and prepare to attack, but their actions, as aggressive and costly as they would become, could not substitute for air cover. Because the Japanese heavy units had the range, the firepower, and the numbers to overwhelm the screen if the carriers were slowed or forced to turn into the wind for sustained launches. And that created a brutal dilemma for the American commanders, because launching aircraft required predictable courses and steady speed, while survival demanded constant maneuvering and maximum evasive action. As the first Japanese shells began to land closer, the escort carriers zigzagged violently, turning into rain squalls for concealment, even as aircraft struggled to find deck space and wind alignment to get airborne. And pilots who did launch often did so under fire, climbing through cloud while tracers and shell splashes marked the sea below, knowing only that their targets were somewhere to the west, and that their job was to slow an enemy force whose presence threatened the entire invasion. The air groups attacked in small, disorganized waves because there was no time to assemble coordinated strikes, and the pilots used whatever weapons they had, strafing superstructures, dropping bombs intended for ground targets, even making dry runs to force Japanese ships to maneuver and break formation, because every turn imposed by an air attack reduced the accuracy of Japanese gunfire and bought precious minutes for the carriers to escape. The Japanese, for their part, were initially confused by the scale of American resistance from the air, because they had expected to encounter little more than patrol planes or scattered aircraft, not a continuous stream of attacks from low altitude. And this confusion caused some hesitation and maneuvering within Kurita's formation, but it did not stop the heavy cruisers from firing repeatedly at the fleeing carriers. And as the range closed, the limitations of American air cover became painfully clear, because many aircraft were running low on fuel after repeated attacks. Others were returning to carriers that were themselves under fire and maneuvering violently, and still others had expended their ordnance with little visible effect against armored targets. The escort carriers' combat air patrol, thin to begin with, struggled to keep Japanese aircraft away, because the immediate threat was not from the air but from the surface. And yet maintaining even a minimal fighter presence was critical, because any successful Japanese air attack could further disrupt flight operations and make the launch of strike aircraft impossible, creating a cascading failure in air cover that would leave the carriers defenseless. As Japanese shells found their mark, near misses caused structural damage and fires aboard several carriers, and USS Gambier Bay, the slowest of the group, began to fall behind, her speed reduced by damage and the strain of constant maneuvering, making her a prime target for Japanese cruisers that shifted fire to exploit her vulnerability. And as she lagged, the pressure on the remaining carriers increased, because the formation could not slow without inviting destruction. And the air groups now faced the impossible task of defending multiple ships simultaneously with dwindling numbers and fuel. Pilots who landed often did so under fire, touching down on pitching decks while shell splashes rose nearby, refueling and rearming at breakneck speed, then launching again with whatever ordnance could be loaded, sometimes flying multiple sorties in a single morning, driven not by orders but by the understanding that if the air cover faltered even briefly, the carriers would be exposed to direct gunfire they could not survive. Communications were fragmented by weather, maneuvering, and the chaos of battle, and while contact reports were sent requesting help from other American forces, the immediate reality for Taffy 3 was that no reinforcement would arrive in time to prevent the next critical phase of the engagement, and so the outcome depended entirely on whether the escort carrier's aircraft could continue to impose enough disruption and delay to offset their lack of firepower. The Japanese force, though powerful, was not immune to pressure, and repeated air attacks forced Kurita's ships to maneuver, broke their formation, and created uncertainty about the true nature of the American force they were engaging, because the persistence of air attacks suggested a larger carrier presence than actually existed. But this psychological effect was fragile, dependent on the uninterrupted appearance of American aircraft over the Japanese ships, and as fuel gauges dropped and losses mounted, the margin for maintaining that illusion narrowed. By mid-morning, the American air cover was stretched to its limits, with aircraft returning from long-range attacks having to ditch or divert to other carriers, and deck crews struggling to keep pace with the tempo, while the Japanese heavy units continued to press the attack, firing through rain squalls and smoke, closing the range despite losses and damage. And as Gambier Bay came under increasingly accurate fire, the possibility that the escort carriers might be overrun became starkly real. The battle was no longer about protecting a landing force or holding a position, but about survival. about whether lightly armed carriers and their overstretched air groups could continue to hold back a surface fleet designed to annihilate them. And as smoke thickened, aircraft dwindled, and Japanese shells felt ever closer, the question hanging over the scene was brutally simple: whether the American air cover could last long enough to prevent the collapse of Taffy 3. Because if it failed, there would be nothing left to stop the Japanese ships from breaking through to the invasion fleet beyond. And at that moment, with Gambier Bay slowing under fire and Japanese cruisers closing in, the balance of the battle hung on a knife edge. As Japanese heavy cruisers shifted fire and closed the distance, because as Gambier Bay continued to lose speed under repeated near misses and direct hits, the American air cover that had so far held the line was beginning to thin in ways that could no longer be hidden by courage or improvisation, with fuel exhaustion, battle damage, and sheer attrition steadily reducing the number of aircraft able to remain over the enemy. And that reduction was immediately felt across the formation as gaps appeared in the attack pattern that had kept Kurita's ships maneuvering defensively rather than advancing in a coordinated push. Gambier Bay's plight forced Rear Admiral Sprague into another set of impossible choices, because breaking formation to protect a single carrier risked exposing the others. Yet abandoning her meant losing not only a ship but also the flight deck that many returning aircraft depended upon. And as Japanese shells began to land with greater accuracy, the remaining escort carriers were compelled to turn sharply and scatter into rain squalls, further fragmenting flight operations and complicating recovery of aircraft that were already operating at the edge of their endurance. Overhead, American pilots saw the change immediately, as fewer friendly aircraft appeared on each pass, and those that did were increasingly forced to make attack runs without coordination, attacking whatever target presented itself rather than concentrating on specific ships, because there was no time, no fuel, and no communications clarity to do otherwise. And yet, even these scattered attacks continued to force Japanese ships to maneuver, to turn away from optimal firing solutions, and to hesitate at moments when a decisive push might have shattered the American formation. The Japanese cruisers Chokai, Chikuma, and Tone pressed forward aggressively, their main batteries firing almost continuously, while Yamato and the other battleships remained farther back, still capable of overwhelming firepower, but partially masked by weather and smoke. And this separation within the Japanese force created a dangerous dynamic, because the cruisers, faster and more aggressive, were now within range to deliver fatal blows to the escort carriers, even if the battleships were delayed or misled. As Gambier Bay took additional hits, her speed dropped further, and a decision was made to abandon efforts to keep her with the group, because doing so would have endangered the remaining carriers. And this moment marked a psychological turning point for everyone involved, because it demonstrated that air cover alone might not be enough to save every ship, and that losses were no longer hypothetical. American destroyers continued to make desperate torpedo attacks and smoke-laying runs, actions that drew Japanese fire away from the carriers and imposed additional maneuvering on the enemy. But these surface actions, though critical, were also costly, and their losses further reduced the overall defensive screen, increasing the burden on the aircraft overhead. As the morning wore on, the escort carriers' flight decks became scenes of relentless activity and growing strain, with deck crews operating under fire, dodging shell splashes, repairing damage as best they could, and cycling aircraft through refueling and rearming with minimal rest. Because every additional sortie represented another chance to delay the Japanese advance, and delay was the only currency that mattered. Pilots returning from attacks often found their designated carrier maneuvering violently or temporarily obscured by smoke and rain, forcing them to divert to other ships or circle until fuel reserves dropped to critical levels. And this uncertainty led to aircraft losses that were not the result of enemy fire, but of exhaustion and operational limits, further thinning the air cover at the worst possible moment. Meanwhile, Japanese commanders were attempting to make sense of the resistance they were encountering, because the persistence of air attacks combined with aggressive destroyer actions suggested to some that they were facing a stronger force than expected. Yet, visual confirmation of escort carriers rather than fleet carriers created confusion and disagreement within Kurita's command structure about priorities and risks. And this hesitation, though subtle, played a crucial role in slowing the Japanese advance at moments when decisiveness might have yielded catastrophic results for the Americans. Still, hesitation did not equate to retreat, and Japanese gunfire continued to fall among the carriers with increasing frequency, and when Gambier Bay finally lost the ability to maintain even minimal speed, she became a stationary target, absorbing fire that might otherwise have been directed at her sister ships, and her eventual fate, though not yet fully apparent to those fighting on, underscored the stakes for everyone else, because it showed that the Japanese guns could and would destroy escort carriers if given the chance. As Gambier Bay fell behind and ultimately slipped from the formation, the remaining carriers pushed eastward, still launching and recovering aircraft when possible, still relying on air attacks to keep Japanese ships at bay, but now with a growing sense that the balance was shifting against them, because the number of aircraft aloft at any given moment was declining. The pilots were exhausted, and the enemy was still advancing. The Japanese cruisers, emboldened by their apparent success against Gambier Bay, pressed closer, and their salvos became more accurate as the range closed, forcing the carriers into ever more radical evasive maneuvers that further disrupted flight operations, creating a feedback loop in which the very actions needed to survive made it harder to maintain the air cover that enabled survival. Above it all, the weather that had initially provided concealment now became a complicating factor, with rain squalls and low clouds breaking visual contact at critical moments, causing aircraft to lose sight of their targets or of each other, and making coordination nearly impossible. Yet these same squalls also intermittently shielded the carriers from direct observation, buying fleeting moments of respite that were exploited to launch or recover aircraft whenever possible. Communications with higher commands remained intermittent, and although calls for assistance were sent and resent, the reality was that any help would arrive too late to affect the immediate crisis, and so the fights remained intensely local, defined by the decisions made on individual bridges and in individual cockpits, decisions constrained by incomplete information and relentless pressure. As the engagement continued, Japanese ships began to suffer damage of their own, inflicted by repeated air attacks that, while individually limited in effect, cumulatively disrupted operations, damaged exposed equipment, and forced crews into damage control, and these effects, though not immediately decisive, began to alter the tempo of the battle in subtle ways, slowing the Japanese advance and increasing the time between coordinated firing solutions. Still, the danger to the American carriers remained acute, because even a single well-placed salvo could cripple or sink one of the remaining ships, and the thinning air cover meant that the window for such a salvo was widening with each passing minute. By late morning, the American air cover was operating at the edge of collapse, with pilots flying on fumes, aircraft landing with battle damage, and deck crews stretched beyond sustainable limits. And yet the attacks continued, driven by the understanding that stopping, even briefly, would likely result in immediate disaster. The Japanese force, though increasingly cautious, was still closing, and the distance between the leading cruisers and the American carriers was now measured in tens of thousands of yards rather than the safer margins of earlier in the fight, making the prospect of a decisive engagement ever more real. As smoke screens dissipated and rain squalls shifted, moments of clarity revealed just how close the Japanese ships had come, and these glimpses reinforced the urgency of maintaining air pressure at any cost, because there was no secondary line of defense, no reserve force waiting to intervene, only the aircraft already committed and the ships struggling to stay ahead of the enemy. The loss of Gambier Bay, now effectively sealed, weighed heavily on the commanders of the remaining carriers, because it demonstrated that escape was not guaranteed, and that air cover, no matter how persistent, might not be sufficient to save them all. And yet even this knowledge did not slow the tempo of operations, because there was no alternative. As the battle approached its most dangerous phase, with Japanese ships still advancing and American air cover stretched thinner than ever, the outcome remained deeply uncertain. And the question was no longer whether the Americans could achieve victory, but whether they could survive long enough for the balance to tip in their favor, or whether the next few minutes would see the air cover finally fail and the remaining escort carriers caught under the full weight of Japanese naval gunfire.
The remaining escort carriers and their air groups continued to fight against time itself as the engagement moved into its final and most decisive phase. Because while Japanese cruisers still pressed forward and American aircraft were stretched to exhaustion, subtle shifts were already taking place inside Kurita's formation that would determine the outcome of the battle without any single dramatic signal to mark the change. Damage accumulated aboard several Japanese heavy cruisers as repeated air attacks struck topside equipment, started fires, jammed turrets, and forced constant maneuvering. And although these hits did not immediately disable the ships, they steadily eroded the ability of Kurita's force to maintain cohesion and momentum. Chokai was badly damaged earlier by air attack and had fallen behind. Suya and Kumano had suffered serious damage that limited their speed and fighting efficiency. And Chikuma, still pressing forward aggressively, was increasingly isolated at the head of the Japanese advance, drawing the attention of American aircraft that continued to attack whenever fuel and opportunity allowed. The Japanese formation, once tightly organized for a decisive strike into Leyte Gulf, was now stretched and fragmented, with ships maneuvering independently to avoid air attack, breaking mutual support and complicating command and control at precisely the moment when decisive coordination was required. Kurita himself faced a growing dilemma because the American resistance he encountered bore little resemblance to the weak escort he had expected, and although his force still possessed overwhelming theoretical superiority, the persistent air attacks, aggressive destroyer actions, and constant uncertainty about the true size of the American carrier force created a picture of a battle whose risks were expanding rather than diminishing. Reports reaching Kurita were incomplete and sometimes contradictory, and the loss of situational clarity was compounded by the weather, smoke, and the need to maneuver constantly under air attack, making it increasingly difficult to assess the actual condition of his own ships or the precise disposition of the American force ahead. Meanwhile, the American air cover, though still dangerously thin, began to benefit from a shift in circumstances because aircraft from other escort carrier groups to the south and east, including elements of Taffy 1 and Taffy 2, were now able to reach the battle area, adding to the pressure on the Japanese ships and reinforcing the impression that the Americans could sustain their attacks longer than expected. These additional aircraft did not arrive in overwhelming numbers, but their presence mattered because it extended the duration of air pressure on Kurita's force at a moment when his ships were already strained. And it reinforced the pattern of continuous harassment that had prevented a decisive Japanese push earlier in the engagement. As Japanese ships took further damage and fuel and ammunition considerations loomed larger, Kurita was forced to weigh the original objective of striking the invasion fleet against the mounting cost of continuing forward against a stubborn and increasingly dangerous opponent. At approximately mid-morning, with reports of heavy damage to cruisers, concerns about air attack intensifying, and no clear picture of the larger American fleet situation, Kurita made the critical decision to disengage, ordering his force to turn north and withdraw from the pursuit of the escort carriers, a decision that effectively ended the immediate threat to Taffy 3 and the invasion fleet beyond. This withdrawal was not immediately apparent to the Americans under fire, because Japanese ships continued to maneuver and fire intermittently as they turned away, and the chaotic nature of the battle meant that confirmation of enemy retreat was slow to reach the escort carriers and their air groups. Even as Kurita's ships began to pull back, American aircraft continued to attack whenever possible, striking exposed cruisers and destroyers during the withdrawal and inflicting further damage that compounded the Japanese losses, including attacks that would later contribute to the sinking of Chikuma and the further disabling of Suzuya.
For the American carriers, the realization that the Japanese were finally disengaging came gradually, marked by increasing distance between shell splashes and the ships, fewer salvos falling among the formation, and the sight of enemy masts receding into the haze and rain squalls to the west. Exhaustion was evident everywhere, from pilots flying their final sorties on fumes to deck crews operating on sheer momentum after hours of unrelenting effort. But the work did not stop, because aircraft still had to be recovered, damaged ships stabilized, and the formation reorganized after the dispersal and losses of the morning. Gambier Bay was gone, a stark reminder of the cost of the engagement, and the destroyers and destroyer escorts that had charged the Japanese force had suffered grievous losses, including ships sunk and crews lost. But the escort carriers themselves, battered and damaged though they were, remained afloat, and more importantly, the invasion fleet at Leyte remained untouched by Japanese surface forces. In the aftermath of the withdrawal, American aircraft continued to range westward, attacking retreating Japanese ships and reinforcing the decision Kurita had already made, ensuring that his force could not regroup for another attempt.
And these follow-on strikes, combined with damage sustained earlier, further weakened the Japanese naval presence in the central Philippines. The battle where American air cover almost failed thus ended not with a dramatic final blow, but with a gradual easing of pressure as the enemy turned away, leaving behind a scene of damaged ships, exhausted crews, and the knowledge that an outcome once balanced on a knife edge had been decided by endurance, improvisation, and relentless pressure rather than overwhelming force. Within hours, the escort carriers resumed their primary mission of supporting operations ashore, even as they dealt with the consequences of the morning's fighting, and the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf moved toward its conclusion, shaped decisively by the failure of Kurita's force to break through at Samar. The immediate effect of the engagement was clear to those who survived it, because the invasion of Leyte continued uninterrupted. The Japanese surface fleet suffered losses it could not easily replace, and the escort carriers, once considered peripheral to fleet actions, had demonstrated their ability to influence the course of a major naval battle through air power alone, even under the most unfavorable conditions. The moment passed without ceremony, marked only by the fading sound of distant gunfire and the steady return of aircraft to battered decks, but its consequences were enduring, because the decision made under pressure that morning by both American and Japanese commanders reshaped the final phase of naval warfare in the Pacific and ensured that the balance of power would never again tilt in Japan's favor in the same way.